What's going on, all you GBA type people? This is Berk, bringing you the Week 10 Power Rankings for the GBA Season 5. Now, I know this isn't Tom. Tom, unfortunately, is not here. He is sick. So, unfortunately, it's just me doing the Power Rankings this week. But we should have a good time. It will be a little bit shorter just because it is only me talking. As well as I'm going to try to cut back on how much I talk about teams that have been eliminated from the playoffs or have pretty much checked out mentally. And there's not really too much left to say about them. They're playing their matches, but that's pretty much all they're doing. So anyway, on to number 16. I still have the Sacramento Sea Kings. Hayden did play a pretty good match this week. It was only a 2-0. Nothing really too blow-outy, just like we've seen in past weeks. And I think he's starting to finally adapt to the playstyle, because he's bringing some different moves on his Pokemon. I like the fact that he brought HP Rock on his Tornadus to catch the Talonflame, because obviously that's going to OHKO. I like the fact, even though, and I can't believe I'm saying this because I hate this mon, he brought AV Claydol to deal with the Mega Alakazam. More innovation than he's shown in past weeks, which is interesting because he's pretty much checked out and doesn't really care about the playoffs, even though he's actually still in contention. Hayden, I think he's still kind of in the mindset that he's still playing not in the format, because there's definitely plays where, for instance, he goes for the Wisp as the Lucario subs, and he knows that the Lucario had leftovers. It's not this kind of standard set. He knocked off the leftovers, and then he still goes for the Wisp, not really expecting it to sub up, which, Lucario with leftovers, why would you put leftovers on Lucario if it's not going to, probably sub up, because Lucario's frail as hell? It's things like that that are still catching him off guard, and he's still falling for those things. He didn't really have an answer for sub CM Lucario, because even though he has an AV Claydol, Claydol is terrible in any sort of format that you could ever think of. Sorry for all you Claydol fans, but it is like the worst Pokemon. I would never, ever, ever want to draft that thing. But anyway, he's at least starting to plan differently. And that's good for him, because if he does decide to come back next season, he's getting some experience to at least not be so standard. And I know there's another coach that's doing better than him that's just basically bringing standard things. I don't really have too much to say about him. He's mentally checked out. He even said at the end of his video he doesn't really give a fuck. So I just want to say about the AV Claydol set, yes, I praised it saying it was innovative and it's different planning, but one thing you don't want to do is have a mon that is specifically for one mon. Like, you plan and say, this is my specific counter for this one mon and nothing else, because what happens if your opponent doesn't bring that mon? And he found out this week that without Mega Alakazam there was no reason for Claydol to be there, so it's just kind of dead weight. Moving on to my number 15, I have the Long Island Red Rockies. I only have Nips' side to go on. I can't say what plays Malone did and what he was thinking, because, he didn't upload his battle, but I'll get to that when I talk to him. Nips is also pretty much checked out. Again, end of his battle. He didn't even check the standings, see how big of a match this was. He's still in the playoff race, but he's like, I didn't even check the standings. I didn't know this is a big match. Of course it's a big match. If you win this, you are so much better in a playoff position, but he didn't even check. So, it doesn't seem like he really cares. Anyway, Nips, he brought the fucking Rapidash. Biggest threat in the league right after Claydol. And I mean that with all sarcasm. And if you haven't noticed from last week, I'm a pretty sarcastic person. Malone should have just, once he saw the Rapidash, he should have just said, you know what, I'm out. I don't have any switch-ins aside from the Gastrodon, the Dust Noir, and the Landorus Therians, so that might be a little bit bad for me. But there was some interesting sets. The Specs Flygon, it was interesting. It had decent coverage. Malone doesn't really have a good switch-in for Draco Meteor, especially because he doesn't have any fairy types. And Fortress doesn't take the hit that well, just because it's pretty poor, especially defensively. He didn't really, I don't even think he really used it terribly well, because he would click Giga Drain so many times, expecting the Gastrodon switch in, but he had already shown the Giga Drain. Why would Malone switch in his Gastrodon on a suspected Giga Drain? It just doesn't make any sense. So it was a good set, but it seemed weird how he was playing it. And just a whole lot of plays in this game. I know it was only a 2-0, but Malone just had the momentum, and Nips was just, even in his commentary, he would say something out loud and then do the exact opposite of what he would just say. Like, he would say, I don't want to waste Rapidash. He lets it take an EQ from the Dust Noir, putting it at like, I don't know, 10%, which means if rocks get set up, that thing's gone. Just like Gastrodon can't do much to the Slowbro, he saw that the Slowbro had shown Toxic. You don't have a Heal Bell on your team. What are you doing? You don't have Rest. The one thing that Mega Slowbro needs is Heal Bell support, because if that thing gets Toxic, doesn't matter how many Calm Minds is set up, because that thing's dying. Nip still doesn't seem to look at the long game at all, nor save the Mons when he needs to. He lets his Scrafty get burned as well. He lets his Mega Slowbro get Toxic. He lets his Rapidash take a huge hit. There's no long game, it's just turn by turn, and the turn by turn's not even going that well for him. So, moving on, the Detroit Steel Wings, coached by Crimson Seabad. Crimson, I can't really go by his commentary, obviously, this week, so there's not really too much to say about him. He is eliminated from playoffs, so I'm just going to go through this kind of quickly. But this battle there was another DC towards the end, but at that point, Crimson was going to be losing anyway. Crimson did bring some interesting sets. Defog Intimidate Staraptor was interesting, although Choice Bandit, which would have been a much better set, I think. Choice Bandit Infernape was pretty good to help break through Geo's just overwhelming bulk. But there's some weird planning, like Psychic over Psyshock on Latios when your opponent has a Blissey. With a Psychic, Blissey is taking hits for days, and he even said, Latios is my intended wall breaker. Slap a Life Orb on that thing, put a Psyshock on there, because there was no reason to keep Psychic. Geo did get a first turn crit on his Cradily with the Sacred Fire. That did actually matter, I calced it. Even fully specially defensive, Choice Bandit Entei cannot take it down one hit. So that was unfortunate because it prevented Crimson from ever getting up the rocks, which I like the attempt of Crimson to try to hazard stack him with spikes, but spikes are so much less effective against Geo's team than stealth rocks. But I see the plan going into it. It was hazard stack Geo and then try to whittle him down with a lot of offense. But unfortunately, because he brought all that offense, he had no switch-ins for things like Draco Meteor from the Latias, which just kind of ran through his team this week. Even with all this offense that Crimson had, he never put his feet down and went on the offense. It was always him U-turning out of there, especially with the ape. He had chances to take down things like the Entei, instead of going for close combat, which would probably have taken down that Entei. He goes for the U-turn, and then lets something take a Sacred Fire. He went in there with the game plan, but he didn't use the offense in the way I think he intended to use it. He was just constantly trying to get switch initiative, and Geo kept staying in and killing things. So, Crimson, yeah, it was a 5-0, but I think Crimson was doing pretty well in the game. The crit sucked, but he's got to keep an eye on what the long game is and actually use the offense. Attack sometimes. That generally works. You're not really getting anywhere. He's bringing some different stuff, which I like. I like the fact that he's bringing different stuff, and he's experimenting with these last weeks, because they really don't matter. Anyway, at my number 13, kind of a big drop, I have Shady in the New York Yankees. Shady, I have a little bit more to say about him. He kind of got manhandled this week. Don't get me wrong, it was a pretty good battle. I think it was like 40-something turns. It was a long battle, because Lars brought like almost the perfect team for him. And what I think Shady's been doing is he's been relying really, really heavily on Sharpedo. Now, I'm not saying Sharpedo's a bad mon. I actually like Sharpedo. It's a good sweeper. It's got decent stats on both sides, so it can attack physical and special, which is great. But if that's your only offense, and that's the offense you're relying on week to week, it's not going to be enough. And you can see that it could not break through Tangrowth. Had he put Ice Beam instead of Ice Fang on Sharpedo, maybe we'd be looking at a different story. But I see why he brought the Ice Fang and not the Ice Beam. Lars has brought AV Tangrowth almost every single week, and then this is the week he brings fully physically defensive with the Rocky Helmet. Mega Venusaur, way too standard this week. And I know I said last week that he could go standard as long as it works. This week it doesn't work, because the dual stab doesn't hit 3 mons at all. Does not hit the Cobalion. Does not hit the Crobat. Does not hit the Scolipede. But nothing. He can't do anything to them. Knockoff, like the EQ knockoff Swords Dance set from last week, actually would have put in a lot of work this week, because he could set up on things like the Tangrowth, possibly a Slow King, because I don't think it was offensive in any manner. He could have actually taken advantage of the fact that Lars had these really massive walls and set up on them. But just with Sledge Bomb and Giga Drain, it wasn't going to be doing much. During the battle, Shady doesn't seem to be focused on what's going on the screen so much. Like, he missed something very obvious, like safety goggles on the Crobat. He just thought it missed instead because he wasn't paying attention to what the text was saying. And you got to pay attention to that because you can get really important information like, hey, the Crobat has safety goggles, you never putting this to sleep. And had he known that, I think his plays would have been a little bit different because he'd be a little bit more wary about actually going for the sleep powder. But because of that, he was able to put the Cobalion to sleep. So I guess that's something. But one thing I heard was, I have no idea what insert name of Pokemon even does. This week it was, I have no idea what Landorus Eye does. I've never seen it before, I don't know what it does. Look it up before the match. Don't, like, when you're planning, you should know what your opponent could possibly bring. You should know Landorus Eye is a huge threat, and you should see its moveset beforehand, so you could probably make an appropriate counter to it, but he doesn't do that. He did not even know what Landorus Eye does. I don't think he's looked at how Lars is used in the past, usually with the Rock Polish Sweeper. And I think I've heard this from other coaches. Just look up what your opponent's Pokemon does. It takes like a 5-minute scroll through various different websites to make sure you know what your opponent could possibly bring. You don't know what it's going to do during the match, but you know what it could possibly do. Shady does make some pretty good early game predictions. He does scout out what the Tangrowth has, and that, you know, he knows how to make plays. And I will give Shady plenty of credit for that, because especially later in the match, when Shady doesn't really have much of a chance to break through the defensive regenerator core, he was making a lot of plays. He was making a lot of reads and making a lot of predictions that were correct. Not just like way off base, but predictions that were actually correct. It still didn't matter though. At that point in the battle, even he could have made the best predictions that he wanted to, and it was more than likely that Shady was still going to lose, just because with rocks up, what's going to happen is Shady's team, his Sharpedo is going to keep getting whittled down every time it has to switch in. Same with even just his defensive mons, the Melodic and the Mega Venusaur. Those are also going to take some chip damage. His offensive mons are going to. The only thing that, you know, doesn't get affected is the Alakazam. But overall, I think Shady played very well. Don't get me wrong. I think Shady played very well, but his planning was not there this week. At number 12, moving up one spot, we've got Steve and the Milwaukee Sawsbucks. And Steve had a fantastic match this week. He is known as the Giant Slayer, and he did slay a giant this week in the form of George and the San Francisco Arcaniners. I felt like Steve, he was making appropriate predictions. He didn't get hacked out this match. He brought some pretty interesting sets. I like the Mesprit, the speed control, plus like fully physically defensive with Adamant, with Thunder Wave to get some speed control. He knows he can take hits from the low punny, Thunder Wave it, all that fun stuff. The Shadow Sneak on the Mega Gardevoir, it didn't do anything during the match, but it was still an interesting move to have because he didn't need that fourth move. Granted, he could have used something like Sub or Calm Mind or something like that. But the Shadow Sneak ensured that, say, the Scizor was really weakened, he could Shadow Sneak, pick it off with the Mega Gardevoir, which would have been really cool to see, but unfortunately, we don't get to see it. He was making some appropriate reads. When his Conkeldurr was in, he knocks off the incoming Rotom, which was a great move on his part. Getting rid of the Rotom worked very well for Steve, because Rotom was going to be quite the annoyance to Steve's team. It dealt with a lot of things, the Mega Gardevoir, the Mesprit, and just other things on Steve's team, and being able to take that down early was great for Steve. To me, this battle, it wasn't as much Steve playing amazingly as it was George just kind of being really off. I'll talk about George when I get to him. He made the good reads when he needed to. He used Hacksters also pretty well this match, setting up on the Mega Low Punny as it switches out, and that bluffing the Scarf first, then setting up, taking down the Bronzong. Great set of plays. So he knew what he was doing. And the one thing that I always like about Steve is his attitude. Yeah, he's pretty much eliminated from the playoffs. It'd be very, very, very hard for him to claw his way back in, but he always has the best attitude, and I really appreciate that from Steve, because he really tries. A lot of the teams that have been eliminated or pretty much eliminated. They're just kind of this, fuck it, I don't really give a shit what happens anymore. But Steve, he's like, I want to win. I'm going to go in every week. I don't care if I'm not in the playoffs. I'm still going to try my best to win. And I really appreciate that, Steve. So keep with a great attitude. At number 11, I have the Pittsburgh Pirates. Tup is now also eliminated from the playoffs, so I'm not going to be talking about him too much. There was just something was just off this week for Tup. His planning, I didn't quite like it. He had nothing for Hydreigon. Like, there was no priority on his team besides Extreme Swing from Arcanine, which is a little shaky from a specially defensive Arcanine. He had nothing Scarf that outsped the Hydreigon, and he didn't have any specially defensive walls aside from Arcanine, which is not taking a Draco Meteor, especially not after rocks. So it was like he didn't seem to plan well around a Scarfed Hydreigon, which is a very common set to see, and especially seeing how it was going to do, how much damage it would do to Tup's team. It just seemed off to me, and it was weird because this was such an important match for Tup, and it just, I think he was trying something different, and it did not work this week. It was still a great match. Tup showed off his observation skills. He knew that it was a shiny Raikou, so he knew it had Aura Sphere, which was a very good observation. Make sure that there's no surprises lying in wait on John's team, so you knew, oh, that has Aura Sphere. I gotta keep an eye on that. The specially defensive wall for Arcanine, I just didn't get. Specially defensive Arcanine isn't bad. Like, don't get me wrong, it can work when it works, but Hydreigon is not the thing that you want Arcanine to wall. Golbat was actually, like, I was looking at some of the calcs, Golbat would actually have been a much better choice. It actually takes a Draco Meteor with less than half, so, and it's 4 times resists the Superpower, which was basically all John needed to click at the end to win. This was just a pretty straightforward match. John had walls for Tup's offense. Tup didn't have walls for John's offense. Once Tup's team had been whittled down enough, there was nothing stopping the Hydreigon to sweep Tup's team. All John needed was just more Mons to start with than Tup. And he did. And it just seemed a little short-sighted on Tup's part. The planning prevented him from actually winning the long game. Yeah, Tup was really in there for quite a few turns, but once John could start clicking Superpower, there was nothing stopping it. Even though Tup is eliminated, I do like the fact that Tup is still going to definitely try to beat Lars and Dan these next coming weekend. I really hope he does, because that'd be pretty funny to see. Tup just didn't seem to have the team matchup nearly as well as I think he thought he did. I did really like the Ambipom set this week. It hasn't really seen much use this season, and it just had great coverage for most of John's team. Unfortunately, it didn't outspeed the Hydreigon. And if it did outspeed the Hydreigon, maybe we'd be looking at a different match, but again, that's the problem with only running Scarfed. Excadrill, Hydreigon has a higher base speed and is just going to outspeed it. So, and that's why Tup's at my number 11. He's been doing really well this season, don't get me wrong. He's improved so much. There's just some short-sightedness when it comes to planning, and his playing has gotten a lot better, don't get me wrong. But he still seems a little bit short-sighted when it comes to the long game. Unfortunately, he's out of the playoffs. So moving on to number 10, he keeps climbing up. We have the Cincinnati Loudreds coached by Malone. Malone gets the win this week against Nips, and I really don't have too much to say about Malone. Hey, here's one thing. When you upload your matches, so I can talk about all the bad plays you make. But he hasn't uploaded his battle, so I can't commentate on it. Maybe by the time this video goes up, his battle will be up, but I don't see that happening. Overall, I mean, Malone brought standard. He went nice and standard this week. You know, physically defensive Fortress, Choice Scarf Landorus, especially defensive Gastrodon. Like, these are things we've seen time and time again. And if it works, I guess. But there wasn't really any surprises lying in wait. It's just Nips didn't really have much of an answer for Mega Manectric and Weavile. He just didn't have an answer for all that offense. I do like that once Malone saw that the Flygon was special, he kind of saved his Gastrodon to make sure it wasn't going to get hit by a Giga Drain, because I don't know if he knew Flygon gets Giga Drain. I'd assume he looked at the moveset, because that's a smart thing to do. Let's look at the movesets. I would assume he would say, oh, this probably has Giga Drain, I don't want to... I'll bring in my Fortress to take the Giga Drain, which he used pretty effectively. Other than that, I really don't have much to say. He played this game pretty safely. He saved his offense for the end when he knew he could just clean up the game with pretty much Weavile and Mega Manectric. He was making some pretty bold plays. He stayed in on the Flygon when it could have been Scarfed. He still, I don't know if he knew it was Scarfed at that point. Maybe he did the damage calcs and saw, this has to be Specs, it can't be Scarfed. But he stayed in on the Flygon and went for the HPIs to take that down, which was, I think, pretty bold. He stayed on the Diggersby, not knowing if that was scarfed, went for the HP Ice to do a lot of damage to it. So that was, you know, some decently bold plays, but they worked out for him. So I can't complain about it, but, you know, Malone, I think, knew what he needed to win. He had the better game plan going into it. And, yeah, not too much else to say. At number 9, the Arizona Deoxys, coached by Gubbs. I think Gubbs played a very smart match. He brought some very interesting sets that I think worked. That sub-CM Lucario takes advantage of Hayden's team. A lot of the walls are not going to be able to do too much to Lucario after it sets up a couple of Calm Minds. I didn't really see Calm Mind at work though. Nasty Plot in this case would have probably been better. You set up a sub, you set up a Nasty Plot, and then you just kind of kill things. He wouldn't have had to rely on the flinch to take out the Slowbro without getting his sub destroyed. It was a very interesting set. I think he used it really well. He knew when to set up, and he was just really he was really giddy when he was like, "Oh, I'm gonna be able to use the set." So it's nice to see that he's really excited about that. The dual Volt Switch and U-turn on the Thunderous, I think, was a little bit unnecessary. Yeah, you're definitely going to be able to get Switch Initiative, but if you're running the U-turn, maybe you don't need to run the Volt Switch, and vice versa. I know during the battle, a lot of times he kept U-turning out instead of Volt Switching or going for the Thunderbolt because he was afraid Claydol come in. I know, Claydol, huge threat. I know. Hit the thing in front of you sometimes. I think Gubbs was over-predicting a little bit too much during this match, and he could have taken out the Tornadus T really easily. And I get he doesn't want to lose any offensive momentum, but through that, he lost a lot of offensive momentum, especially when the Tornado stayed in on Thunderous. Gubbs, it was pretty critical during the match of Hayden, you know, talking about Hayden making bad plays. They were risky, but you got predicted. And they're not bad plays if they work, I guess. Nah, they're still bad plays, but he got predicted. And what happened was Gubbs started getting really flustered by Hayden making apparently really bad plays. I know we're all human and we have emotions and we can get flustered by the things other people do, especially in matches and hacks and things, but he seemed to just kind of react a little bit too poorly to the plays Hayden was making, a little too poorly from the stat boost from the Claydol. It's a freaking Claydol. It ain't doing shit, right? It's Claydol. So he needs to make sure to stay calm during these battles, because the more flustered you get and the more, I don't know, upset you get by some of the plays your opponent's making, the more likely you're about to make a misplay yourself. It was a relatively hacksy battle, and I think Gubbs came out on top of the hacks, but Gubbs had a pretty good game plan going into this battle. Punch a hole with the Lucario, clean up with the Talonflame and the Thunderous, and that's exactly what he did. With the Lucario, he was able to just straight take out the Slowbro and take out the Breloom. Granted, the DC did happen towards the end, but, you know, there wasn't really much Hayden can do at that point, and Gubbs had the match. So, Gubbs played well, he's really in the playoff race, and it was a very solid showing by Gubbs, and if he keeps this up, he could probably make the playoffs. At number 8, I have the Boston Red Sox. Nick gets the forfeit, yay, and it secures Nick the playoff spot, so congrats for him. That's it. At number 7, I have the St. Louis Rampardos. He played Fizz this week, and it was a very good battle. Dan, I think, prepped very well for this. He had some good sets. Spec Sylveon could just pretty much punch a hole straight through Fizz's team, but the problem was he led off with it and was not able to take out the Charizard in one hit, and then let it get whittled down so much that Fire Blast did massive damage. And what ended up happening was that was one of his biggest offensive pressures, basically down to nothing, which could then be easily revenge killed, or in this case, taken out with a combination of Sandstorm and Toxic Spikes. Dan also made, I think, a little bit of odd plays. Instead of going for like raw damage on the Heliolisk, he goes for the Toxic, which I can see why he went for Toxic, but it might have been better just to go for something like Thunderbolt, just to get a little bit more damage on the Heliolisk, so over time maybe it would be more easily revengeable, but, you know, that's just a little bit of nitpicking. He brought an AV, especially defensive, bulky water type, with Mirror Coat. I wonder where he saw that before. It was a good set, had it killed Starmie, but unfortunately Starmie lives on like 1 HP. From the start, it looked like Dan was going to be taking the offensive momentum right out of the gate. But as soon as the Charizard went down, Dan was pretty much on the back foot from then on. Fizz was predicting him pretty well throughout the entire battle, getting damage off on a lot of his walls where it needed to be. Dan really didn't have much once the Sylveon went down for a lot of the defense that Fizz was bringing. The Tyranitar, not really too much for that. The Wheezing, only other thing he had was the Victini. There wasn't too much he could actually do to reliably take out a lot of Fizz's team without hoping to get some sort of like super crits or anything like that. Dan's team was getting whittled down, and he had to make some risky plays toward the end, such as like bringing Victini in on the Starmie and then go for the Bolt Strike, hoping he could live a Scald. It seemed overly risky, but at that point he had to make some plays to at least try to claw himself back into the match and lower the differential, and it worked. He was able to kill the Starmie. That was the only thing that could take all the hits from Aggron very well, but unfortunately it was a little bit too late in the match. He tried to switch around Fizz's team at the end to get some differential back, but unfortunately at that point literally everything on Fizz's team took Aggron on very well. He had Garchomp, Heliolisk, and Wheezing, and none of those had any problem dealing with Aggron, so it was a nice try to shuffle Fizz team around, but it wasn't going to work. Overall, Dan prepped pretty well. Like, there was no overly big flaws with prepping, but he just let his offense, especially the Sylveon, take too much damage in the beginning of the game that it couldn't really do anything. Once it went down to the Toxic Spikes and the Sand midway through the battle, I mean, that was one of his biggest offenses, and then letting Jolteon go down too, that was another at least decent offense that Dan didn't have anymore. He had to rely on Victini to somehow kill things and kill everything, but once that got Pursuit trapped, then Dan loses the Victini. It's pretty much game, because, I'm sorry, but a combination of Uxie, Mega Aggron, and Blastoise is not going to be able to take down the Tyranitar, the Wheezing, the Garchomp, the Heliolisk. It's not going to be able to take down all of that. Moving up above Dan, actually, at number 6, I have the San Francisco Giants, coached by Gio. Gio played a very good game against Crimson this week. Gio was able to use a lot of his bulk very well. The fact that his Blissey just absolutely walled the crap out of Latios just took so much offensive pressure off of Gio's team, because he could always switch in Blissey on Latios. There wasn't really too much out there planning from Gio this week. It was actually relatively standard, except for the fact that he brought the same Entei set as he brought last week. It was the same 4 moves, 3 attacks and Toxic. It's a good set. It was overall a pretty standard week for Gio, but that's all he needed. All he needed and used was that Choice Scarf Latios. He knew that when he looked at Crimson's team, he saw Crimson's team was extremely, extremely offensive, and because of that, he knew he could take advantage of the fact that Crimson didn't have a switch in for Draco Meteor. And if the Latios wasn't scarfed, then he also knew Latios outspeed the entirety of Crimson's team, and he could just keep clicking the Draco Meteor button. And I like the fact that he actually never went for Defog because the rocks weren't there. And yeah, Crimson was setting up spikes, but Gio knew that the spikes weren't really going to be hurting his team too much. And it was a very similar way that John won his match. Basically, anytime he could, Gio would bring in the Latios, and then what takes a Draco Meteor? The Roserade, and that was it. And once the Roserade went down, then there was nothing to take a Draco Meteor, and Crimson had to continually sack off something every time the Latios came in. And because the Latios was such a threat, he didn't even need to use his other offensive threats like the Mega Pinsir. That never even touched the field. Granted, it would have had the DC not happened. Gio played a very smart match this week. This battle for Gio was just find a way to bring in Latios, kill something with Latios. And it worked out very well for him. I know Crimson has been really low on my list. It was still a very well-played match for him, and I think Gio's been using his offense really well. And I like what I saw this week. I like what I see from Gio pretty much every week. He's been using his team very well. He knows how to use it. He's been using it very reliably. And this week was no different. And it brought him a pretty big 5-0 win. Getting this really big win really put him in a much more favorable position to get into the playoffs, and I was just overall very impressed with how he's been playing this week and in previous weeks. Number 5, I have the San Francisco Arcanines moving down from number 3, and the biggest reason, George has been on a little bit of a downturn. He's not playing how he normally plays. This this week and last week, he's not making the reads I think he's been doing. He just seems off. His planning wasn't too bad. He brought some interesting sets. Pie-Up Berry Needle Queen, it almost worked. Defensive Scizor was a very good set to help take on Haxorus. Haxorus does not get any fire moves, so he knew he'd use Defensive Scizor to take that on because Haxorus is a very, very big threat. When it came to the actual playing, it's just like he's making the obvious plays. He's making the really obvious plays, such as he has his Shiftry in on the Rotom, and instead of going for the knockoff, which would have been the better play, he just goes for the Leaf Storm. He revealed the Power Herb Dig, and I saw that, I was like, holy crap, Power Herb Dig. Doesn't even kill Heatran. Had the knockoff happened, that'd be dead Heatran. And it would have put George in a much better place because then he wouldn't have lost his Shiftry. Then he also sends his Rotom in on a knockoff from the Conkeldurr. Yeah, the really obvious play Steve could have done was the Mach Punch, but the really obvious play George could have done was switching his Rotom, and he did. And this isn't something that George normally does. He identified that the Rotom was his win condition. He even said in his team builder, this Rotom is my win condition. I gotta save this thing. And he played really risky with it, and it really bit him in the ass because then knockoff happens, Rotom dies, and George is in a terrible position because he needed those mons to stay alive to actually win the game. But without Shiftry and Rotom, two mons you don't normally say, these are my win conditions, he was just put in a really, really terrible position for the rest of the match. It wasn't the normal George plan. He was not making the bold plays he normally likes to. He was able to just kind of barely claw his way back to the match very late and save some differential, but there's no way that George was ever going to win that match at the end, especially after a Lopunny had been burned. Steve really needed to fuck up badly to lose that match, but he doesn't. Or Steve had to miss 2 Zen Headbutts in a row, which, it's Steve, so it's likely, and he didn't. So George moves down. He's on a downturn, and will he be able to bring it back next week? He has a very tough match. Granted, he has a playoff spot locked, so it's not like he might be losing this playoff position, but still. Well, at number 4, I have the Real Maril, coached by Miguel, aka Mega Mogwai. He didn't play this week. He took the forfeit. And yes, he took the forfeit, and you should play your fucking matches. He did at least put up a video explaining why he didn't. And I get when family emergencies happen and you gotta put off playing the match. Granted, he said he didn't want to rush the match with Nick. He should have at least played. I feel like he should have at least played because you never know what's going to happen in the match. Yeah, he could have been 6-0'd, yeah, or he could have won. But really, he says all of this was the reason he couldn't play. Really, I just think he saw Crescent Scarm and just said, fuck it, I'll take the forfeit. That's what I would have done. So, moving on to number 3, we have John, the New Orleans Pelipers. He's bringing some familiar sets. Sets he knows how to use. Regen Reuniclus, Scarf Hydreigon. And Scarf Hydreigon, luckily this week, outsped everything on Tup's entire team. And it was a very good idea to put Rocky Helmet on Reuniclus. He can switch in, take the hits he needs to, switch back out, whittle down Tup's physical attackers, and get the health back up. John had taken advantage of Tup's pretty significant fighting and rock weakness. He made sure that the rocks were up. He made sure that he could, at the end, sweep with Hydreigon. It was a pretty obvious end goal that John was going for after seeing Tup's team. Nothing really wanted to take superpower aside from the Jellicent, and so once he got the Jellicent out of the way, every time the Hydreigon comes in, he clicks superpower. And he never risked it too. He never risked his win condition. Overall, I feel like this match was just pretty straightforward. John whittled down all of Tup's defensive options. He made sure the Arcanine was low enough where it wouldn't be able to take a superpower, even after the Intimidate, wouldn't be able to take a Draco Meteor, and overall it's just a very strong showing that we've seen from John week to week. He knew this match was really important, he planned a lot, and he comes out with, yeah, close win, but a pretty big win. It might have been a 1-0, but it was a very definitive 1-0 in John's favor, and he didn't even have to risk the Draco Meteor miss right at the end. He could just click superpower, then switch in and out and switch in and out, and he had more mons at the end, which meant that he could switch in and out more often, sack off things he didn't need. I really like the fact that he also used the Regenerator Reuniclus with the Rocky Helmet to get chip damage off on the Excadrill to put Excadrill in range of a superpower from Scarfed Hydreigon. It was very good, methodical playing by John, and it secured him the win. Good playing, John. It was a very good match on both sides, but John just had the upper hand in this battle. He knew what he had the end goal in mind. He played the long game much better, and he was able to get the, not really sweep, but basically sweep with Hydreigon. So at number 2, climbing back up the ladder, we have Lars of the Borussia Don fan. What can I say? Lars didn't even have to play like that fantastically this week. And what I say by that is, I'm not saying like, oh my god, Lars played like shit. Lars brought such the perfect team for Shady that I feel is the best team he's ever brought for anyone. It was perfectly built. It dealt with all the offense that Shady had. Sharpedo couldn't break through anything. Rotom Heat, which actually can hurt both the Tangrowth and the Slowking, couldn't even break through the Slowking. AV Slowking just took all the hits that it needed to. I loved the Safety Goggles Nasty Bat from Lars. It was just really good planning. He knew that he could use this to just completely shut down the Mega Venusaur. It's a shame the damage output is still pretty underwhelming despite a +2. Doesn't even take out the Rotom Heat at like 25%. So Lars knew what he needed to bring, and it really shows. And when your planning is this on point, you don't even need to play well. Lars wasn't really making many predictions. He could play safe and just slowly whittle Shady's team down once he got the rocks up. The only part where he's making predictions is like just spamming the rocks button, hoping he wakes up and trying to get it in anytime he could. Once those rocks went up, he just went between Slowking, Tangrowth, and Shady could barely ever do enough damage to even get it out of regenerator range where they wouldn't just come back in at full health. And then he had his end goal in mind, which was to just kind of clean up the game with Mega Absol, which you could see it getting 4 kills this week. My only real complaint of Lars this week was he did not scout for Ice Beam on the Sharpedo, which could have dealt a crap ton of damage to Tangrowth. From his commentary, he kept saying, the Ice Fang's not going to do much, the Ice Fang's not going to do much, and you're right, the Ice Fang wasn't going to do much, but had Shady brought the Ice Beam, that could have probably broken through the Tangrowth. So he didn't scout for it at all, and that could have really hurt him. Granted, I know the Sharpedo didn't have Ice Beam, but it's just something in the playing that I saw. I was like, you have a pretty also safe switch into Cobalion on the Sharpedo because it ain't doing much to Cobalion either. I would have liked to see him scout for that, but apparently didn't need to. Great game by Lars, great planning, and he's really showing why he's one of the best competitors this season. And now, at number 1, we have Fizzy Stardust. And I know I was really tempted to put him down at number 5. There's a really convincing argument in the comment section last week. So I was like, I could see putting Fizzy at number 5. But he beat Dan this week. And Fizz played this game while sick. Sick of everyone doubting that he is the best ever. But really, Fizz played this game very smart. I really liked the T-Tar set this week. Choppleberry fully physically defensive to take out the Victini without taking much damage. That was a fantastic set, and it worked. He let his Charizard Y go down very early in this match, but to be honest, it wasn't really going to be doing too much aside from really threatening the Mega Aggron, which pretty much everything else on Fizzy's team already threatens the Mega Aggron, and he has a really reliable wall. The Life Orb Heliolisk really did put a number on Dan's team. He really didn't have a switch into it. The Jolteon was the only thing that outsped, and that took a ton of damage from a Hyper Voice. I don't think it was Solar Power. I didn't see it take any Solar Power damage. Had it been Solar Power, then the Jolteon would have died immediately, but I feel like it was probably like Sandvale or something, knowing Fizzy. Once the Jolteon was out of the way, Life Orb Heliolisk, anytime it came in, it outsped everything and could get a free Volt Switch off on anything. Granted, the Blastoise with the AV would obviously threaten it because it could do a lot of damage to pretty much everything after a Volt Switch. The Starmie was a really good set. It was actually able to live the Mirror Coat from the Blastoise, so good on that. And the Toxic Spikes this week really helped out Fizz, helped get some passive damage on a lot of Dan's team. It took down the Sylveon and the Blastoise, so it really worked out for him. It especially made sure that the Sylveon can't switch in, especially after Sand. There's been something this week with, I don't want to go for like Focus Blast because what happens if I miss? And Fizzy said he didn't want to go for Focus Blast on the Mega Aggron because he didn't want to miss, yet he could have killed the Mega Aggron. He had a 70% chance of killing it with a Focus Blast and a 0% chance of killing it with the Volt Switch, and he decided to go with the 0% chance, so was able to use Tyranitar really well. That pursuit button just comes in clutch so often. Pursuit trapping the Victini, pursuit trapping the Uxie. It's just a go-to button for him to press. Continue to press the pursuit button for however long he wants to. Fizz just was able to keep in control that entire time. And he even said he played Dan like a fiddle this week, which, not too far off. Getting that big 3-0 win really just solidified his dominance in this season, because somehow Fizz is still the underdog at 9-1. I don't get that. He's won almost all his matches, and yet still people are saying, I don't think Fizz can do it. I don't think he's even that good. His team's not that great. But you know what? Fizz, you're doing pretty good. And one thing I wanted to ask is, if Focus Blast always hits, like you say at the end of your video, why did you not go for it the first time you could against Mega Aggron? God damn it, Fizz. But overall, it's just a great showing from Fizz. He really shows why he's #1 in this league. Is he going to be able to take it all the way? Guess we'll have to see. But that is going to wrap up the Week 10 power rankings for the GBA Season 5. Hope you enjoyed. I know probably not as good without two people talking back and forth, but you got to make do with what you got. And leave your own power rankings in the comment section below. As always, I'd love to hear what all of you think. And I don't know, give me a reason why you still think Fizzy shouldn't be #1, because that'd be really funny to hear. Next week, it should return back to normal. Tom will be back. We'll have, all that fun stuff. But that's all I got for today. My name is Berk. I'll see y'all next time.